Welcome, everyone, to the California Water Data Consortium's June Data for Lunch, Developing Drought Early Warning Systems in California with Dr. Alvar Escriva-Bou from UC Davis. I'm Elisa Salonis-Centric, the Senior Communications and Outreach Manager at the consortium, and I will be introducing our speaker and supporting today's discussions. We also have our CEO and President, Robin Grimm, on the call. Robin, if you want to give a little wave. Oh, great. To help facilitate and moderate today's discussion and Q&A. So let's get started. A couple of housekeeping items before we begin. Yes, this meeting is being recorded and will be sent out via email. So if you're online or you receive our emails, you'll get that in your inbox within the next week or so. It's also posted to our website and our YouTube channel. Questions are welcome throughout the presentation. So again, please add them to the chat box in Zoom. I'll be compiling them for our Q&A at the end of the presentation. And there will be a survey at the end of the event as well. So when you close your Zoom window, please make sure to fill that out. It helps us plan for future Data for Lunch events. This is today's agenda. Alvar's presentation will be about 35 minutes or so. Then we'll have time for a facilitated discussion where we've prepared a couple questions ahead of time, which Robin will be presenting. And then Alvar has also graciously agreed to stay on Zoom for another half hour past 1 o'clock. So we'll have an opportunity for informal discussions where you can, ask him your questions yourselves or engage in discussion. And again, feel free to pop your questions into the Zoom chat throughout today's event. For those less familiar with the consortium, we are an independent nonprofit created through a partnership between state agencies and non-state entities. Our mission is to catalyze innovative water management through advancement and use of open data, especially in the face of climate change. We do this by bringing people and institutions together to share ideas, synthesize information, and design smarter ways to use and share data. Our work spans research, tool development, hosting webinars and panels, shaping policy recommendations, and helping our community come together around a shared vision for open data and climate resilience. I'm going to drop our website into the chat for you to learn more. You all are here today because of our Data for Lunch series. It's just one of the ways we fulfill our mission. I'd also like to take a moment to thank our sponsors, the California Department of Water Resources and Environmental Science Associates, for making this Data for Lunch series possible. Environmental Science Associates, or ESA, was founded in the Bay Area in 1969 and has 12 California offices. Their team has deep experience supporting a variety of water resource management needs across the state, including as partners on the groundwater accounting platform alongside us, Environmental Defense Fund, and Olson. If you and your organization are interested in sponsoring a future Data for Lunch event or have ideas, feel free to reach out to me directly for more information. I'll drop a link to the sponsorship flyer in the chat. And then our next Data for Lunch event is actually in partnership with the FloodMar, or Manage Aquifer Recharge Network, in August, on Wednesday, August 6th from 12:30 to 1:30 p.m. It'll be featuring an overview of the groundwater accounting platform and related project updates, including upcoming events. So a link to join the meeting is on their webpage. You don't have to register for that. So that's on this slide right now. We'll also be sending out a promotional email and LinkedIn reminders in the coming weeks. And then finally, if you're eager to continue today's conversation, which I really hope you are, we're having an exciting collaboration coming up on August 19th. We're partnering with the California Data Collaborative for a pre-summit workshop focused on aligning urban water data reporting for better drought resilience. So that's a workshop before their California Water Data Summit happening at UC Davis from about August 19th to the 21st. So here's a link to register and check out more details. There's an option to join the full summit or just the workshop. So we hope to see you there. Okay, with all that in mind, I'm excited to welcome Dr. Alvar Escriva-Bou from UC Davis to our Data for Lunch today. Alvar is an assistant professor of civil and environmental engineering at UC Davis, where he applies systems approaches to water, energy, and environmental resource management. His research bridges engineering and economics to assess drought impacts, improve urban and agricultural resilience, and analyze policy trade offs, with particular focus on integrating human dimensions into these complex systems. So, today he'll be sharing learnings and lessons from his research developing drought early warning systems in California. Over to you, Alvar.
Thanks so much, Alyssa. So I'll share my screen. Good? Yeah. Okay. Hello, everyone. Thanks for attending this presentation. Thanks to the California Water Data Consortium. I just see that I have a typo in the first slide. So, thanks, Robin, and thanks, Alyssa, for inviting me. And I also wanted to first acknowledge the funder, so the National Integrated Drought Information System, NIDIS, with Amanda Sheffield and Beba De Esa and Britt Parker have been funding this project for, I think, almost 5 years now. We are trying to keep the collaboration. So thanks to NIDIS for the continuous support. And I also wanted to acknowledge, I'm just presenting this. This has been quite a team effort for over the past years. We started that when I was at the Public Policy Institute of California, and in that moment we had Jeff Mount, Ellen Hannock, Mike Dettinger, Ted Grantham, and Andrew Ayers as the first uh, lead authors of this project. Then Kurt Schwabe, Jose Medellin, John Abatsoglu, and Greg Pierce have been in the second phase of this project. And I also wanted to acknowledge, Armen Canalian and Anissa Gomez Cervantes, who are my students at UCLA, Spencer Cole at PPIC, and Annabelle Roser, who started with this effort with me many years ago. And all these people have been working a lot with this project. So let me just start with the motivation, or like why this matters. And we all know that California is prone to droughts, and the recent drought, the 2012-16 and the 2020-22 droughts, have caused severe economic and environmental damages. And we also know that climate change is exacerbating these impacts. But somehow I think, we started with the premise that the lack of information that we have in some of these issues kind of challenges our decision making. And many times, maybe too many times, we're using reactive actions instead of proactive actions to manage droughts. So why is that? I would say that we don't have even a transparent way to define where we are in a drought in California. And at least what it's quite, it's been quite used, is the US Drought Monitor, which is a kind of a quite simple tool, but to me, a great communication tool to define drought conditions. But it's been some criticism to this tool, especially in California, because this kind of simplified manner of defining drought, it fails to represent the complexity of California water. So our kind of first hypothesis was, okay, could we improve this definition of drought? And why this definition is not easy is because California has a really complex water system. We have almost 15,000 dams or reservoirs. We store, we convey water long distances, and basically there's a disconnection between the sources of water and the water users. And this disconnection makes characterizing drought a more complex topic. Also, and to me, this is probably the most innovative parts of this research, is that we are thinking about droughts and we think about the user. We don't think about a top-down approach, but rather we are thinking about bottom-up approach. How users feel drought. And I'm saying that in the way we start is like different sectors, different users, different cities, small communities, agriculture, freshwater ecosystems, even different cities with these different supply portfolios feel drought differently. They have different adaptation options and they have different potential impacts. So what we wanted to connect is these sources of water with the users and with their potential adaptation options to assess drought and drought impacts. So over this presentation, I am gonna try to cover these three main questions. And the first question is, what indicators could help define drought for California water users? Which are the sources of information and which indicators could help better characterizing drought in California? The second is that we manage water a lot. And for that, we have to explicitly account for water management in California. So how water management actions mitigate or amplify drought conditions. And I'll try to respond to that. And then the third one is that there's been, and this is quite a scientific gap that many have highlighted, that there's a disconnection between drought conditions and drought impacts. And the idea of this project, kind of the initial idea was, could we define better drought indicators that could be better related to the drought impacts? So what are the expected impacts of droughts for different users given specific conditions? So on this look like maybe broad or more researchy questions. So I wanted to give you a few more specific and questions that we wanted to answer. For example, how much surface deliveries could we expect given how much water we have right now in storage, how much water or how much snow do we have in the mountains right now? Oh, sorry. How much pumping? Given this pumping, how much groundwater decline could we see this year? Given these management situations like the surface water, agricultural demands, urban demands, and could we try to obtain this kind of in advance or in real-time conditions? And then given these groundwater declines, this has implications for other users. How many domestic wells could be impacted? We all know that climate change is increasing evapotranspiration, so agricultural demands, and also outdoor demands in cities. So how much more agricultural or urban outdoor demands are expected given the temperatures that we have this year? For example, this could be an answer. What are the expected environmental impacts in a river given the current stream flow conditions? And finally, also, what are the expected economic or socioeconomic impacts in a city, irrigation district, given drought conditions and expected management actions? So these are kind of the questions that in more detail we want to provide. And for that, the main question behind this is, can we develop better information systems to improve drought planning and management? So these information systems could be better used to inform decision making. But before getting into the details, I wanted to bring this sentence or this quote. This quote was brought to me by Mike Dettinger. It's a quote by Kelly Redmond, state meteorologist, and it's because sometimes it's difficult even to define drought, but I think that this definition really matches our goals in this project. And this, a drought can be simply but carefully defined as insufficient water to meet needs. And I'm saying that links or meets the goals of our project because has kind of the user implicitly here. So it's insufficient water to meet the needs of somebody, right? Or some sector. And getting into this, I don't want to get into academic discussion here, but I think it's important to understand this for the whole presentation that I'm going to do, because drought impacts are not only caused by the lack of water or by insufficient water. That insufficient water, it's actually the drought hazard, what we call drought hazard, right? It's the possible occurrence of some natural or human-induced physical event. So the drought hazard is that reduction in water availability. But then a sector, a city, irrigation district, or river has to be exposed to that drought hazard, and then it has to be vulnerable, or different vulnerability means that we are going to have different impacts. So the drought risk or the drought impact, it's not only caused by the lack of water, but also by the capacity to adapt or the capacity to deal with this scarcity. So you'll see at the very end, we have a section on how we are assessing these issues. But let me get into the details of what we have been doing. And I wanted you to understand this project has two main kind of parts. The first part is to understand better drought hazard. That's why I brought this slide earlier. And we want to understand drought hazard better by accounting for infrastructure, by incorporating water infrastructure and management into drought definitions, and also by integrating the different portfolios of users, different water portfolios from different cities or irrigation districts or others. So we want to have a more nuanced view of these drought conditions. And then the second part is to connect drought conditions, the drought hazard, with the impact. And that's by understanding the users' exposure and vulnerability to droughts. That's why I brought these figures again. We are really interested in management, in infrastructure, and we are also interested in users and how users react to droughts. So let me get back to this slide. I'm going to start trying to respond to the first question. What indicators can help define drought for California water users? So first, I would like to bring the main water users that we have been considering in this project are cities, small communities, irrigated agriculture, and freshwater ecosystems, right? So these different users have different supply portfolios. Basically, we could say that cities and irrigated agriculture, and here we are kind of putting everyone in a box, but they are usually larger water suppliers that have in California, many of them have a diversified water portfolio with deliveries from storage, groundwater, even some riparian water right holders, and imports. We have imports from longer distances here in California. So cities and irrigated agriculture have this more diversified supply portfolio, and we want to account for that. We separated small communities or small suppliers, especially thinking about these small suppliers that are groundwater dependent. There's a lot of small suppliers in California that rely only on groundwater, and they have only this water source. So it's important to understand how groundwater levels change in affecting their or in characterizing their drought hazard. And then for freshwater ecosystems, it's mostly based on river flows, but California has some wetlands or um, some environmental users that actually get water from storage too by long distances or imports. So in getting into that thing on like how we can define better droughts, at the beginning of this project, we realized that some of the stakeholders that we work with, maybe we were talking too theoretically. So we thought, okay, we have to start from what's the final thing that we want to develop. And the final thing was to develop a drought dashboard. And we developed this mock-up several years ago to try to help people understanding what was our final goal. So here on the left, you have like what could be a landing page, and you would have the different hydrologic regions in California with the colors that will be represented by the same kind of US drought monitor drought intensities, right? So you could click on each of these hydrological regions, and then you could have a second page where you could have for each hydrologic region, you would have the drought indicators that would be important for that hydrologic region, and then a characterization of the overall drought status given the supply portfolio of this region. But then we wanted also to highlight that different users, cities, small communities, irrigated agriculture, or freshwater ecosystems could have different drought conditions, even at the same time, because they have different supply portfolios or different, yeah, mostly because of the supply portfolios. So you could click on any of these sectors and you would get a differentiated um, drought dashboard or characterization for each of these sectors. So getting to this, I mentioned a few minutes ago that we wanted to do for characterizing droughts better, we wanted to do two things. First was to develop better drought indicators, so define better drought for users, and then to also look at how users with different supply portfolios um, can be characterized. So in the top, we have the different indicators for mostly for the water sources or water supply sources. And then in the how we combine them, it's what we call users with different supply portfolios is how we would get the drought characterization for these users. I didn't mention, but at this moment, we have been working at a hydrologic region level. We are interested in going at finer scales, and I'll talk about that later. So why or which drought indicators are more interesting for California? So we finally finished or end up defining six, actually seven, because we have two for groundwater. But the first two are because we couldn't avoid talking about precipitation and evapotranspiration. Precipitation is mostly for rain-fed agriculture, or could talk also about forests. And evapotranspiration is really important for demand anomalies. So let me just tell that these indicators are meant for users, so for some users' needs. So precipitation for rain-fed agriculture or evapotranspiration for demand anomalies on agriculture or outdoor use in cities. Surface water, which includes both water in reservoirs and snowpack, it's really important for surface deliveries. We have also groundwater levels that could give us information about groundwater supplies and also aquifer conditions for dry wells. And then we have stream flow that gives us an information about environmental stress. And finally, we want to define imports because some regions in California, many users are highly dependent on imports. So we wanted to define drought indicators for imports. So we already did this. Actually, we have a paper under review and all the data and code to develop all these six indicators, actually seven, as I mentioned, because we have two for groundwater. It's already publicly available in a GitHub that I'll share later. But just to give you an information of what we did, it's, for example, for surface deliveries, we have water, so we have the conditions for each reservoir, and then we define different drought conditions for the reservoir, but we also add snow water content. Actually, this methodology was developed by Mike Dettinger. Previously, we adopted and used this to define drought indicators for surface water deliveries. So this gives us an idea of the drought conditions given both water storage in reservoirs and snowpack. We can do the same for groundwater. And I was mentioning that we developed two different indicators for groundwater. And this is because we have a really, most of us know, or most of you know that we have groundwater decline and groundwater depletion in California. So we have a long-term overall trend that goes down over time. We are expecting to stop that with Sigma. But if you don't consider this trend, we are going to find that groundwater drought, only looking at levels, it's always more important at the very end. But actually, what we did is to obtain this indicator of the groundwater elevation indicator that doesn't actually detrend information. It's just how your groundwater level compares to historical levels. But then we did another indicator that gives us information about the intensity of pumping. What we are doing here is the trending, the groundwater level indicator. We take out the trend so we can actually better define droughts. For example, here you see but that in 2017 and 19 were really wet years. If you only look at the elevation indicator, you are not going to see a big change because groundwater level is much, lower in the San Joaquin Valley that it was maybe in the 90s or in the 2000s. But when we the trend is, we actually can see that 2017 was a really good year, and farmers or cities stopped or pumped much less water than in most of the previous years. So that gives us information about how much they are pumping with respect to historical conditions. Okay, but getting to the point of this, our goal is to develop these indicators because we want to understand deliveries. We want to understand conditions or what, so for example, in the surface water drought indicator gives us water deliveries or could give us also imports. Groundwater indicator can give us groundwater deliveries, can actually give us information about dry well exposure or vulnerability. And evapotranspiration can give us information about demand anomalies. Similarly, stream flow is going to give us information about ecosystem impacts. So I wanted to bring this graph because it's kind of an example of how these indicators can be used. And this is the surface water availability index that combines surface water in reservoirs and snowpack. And we kind of obtain the relationship between this indicator, the surface water availability index, and surface water deliveries in the San Joaquin Valley. And we can see that we have a good correlation, especially in drought years. We have when the drought indicator is really low, we have really low deliveries, and then it kind of plateau at above 0.5 or so. We actually can correlate also, this is an interesting indicator, the water availability indicator for the delta exporting basins with the CBP imports to the San Joaquin River. And if you are from California, you might know that we are importing water from the delta through the CBP to the San Joaquin River. So we also get a good correlation between imports as a function of the surface water availability index in the delta exporting basins. And on groundwater, what we obtain is really interesting because what happens with groundwater is that when we are in drought, we actually pump more. And what happens is that with the groundwater index, when it's really low, when we have droughts, we increase pumping. And this is kind of a management decision. And we wanted to include this in the characterization because we are also interested in how water users manage the different supply sources. Just to finalize this first part, I wanted to highlight that we have these results for all hydrologic regions in California, like the precipitation deficit index, evapotranspiration anomalies, stream flow conditions, surface water availability, groundwater elevation, and delta imports. One interesting thing here also, that for example, we are using similar data or also the same data that the California Department of Water Resources is using for the California Water Watch. One thing that we are bringing here is try to standardize these with percentiles that look like the US Drought Monitor. And what we can see here is compare this with the 30-year, the 1990 to 2020 historical record to see how current conditions compare to this 30-year window. So what we can see is that different, for the different indicators, we're going to have different drought conditions because there's different conditions depending on for example stream flow. Maybe this month in the past 3 or 12 months that we use data for, it was not in such bad conditions like evapotranspiration or precipitation. So, or the delta imports as well, for example, was better than groundwater elevation. So these things give us a lot more nuanced information while somehow keeping the simplicity of drought indicators. We obtain also, this is just for you, like we can look at the historical development of all the indicators, and we see this is called this case cascading impacts or effects between precipitation, evapotranspiration, stream flow, surface water availability. There's different temporal effects for each of these indicators. And this could help us actually identifying, okay, if we are starting to have a lot of precipitation deficit index, it's likely that we're going to have stream flow deficit in the future, or surface water availability problems in the near future. Okay, so that was the first part on developing better or more nuanced drought indicators. Then how water management actions mitigate or amplify these drought conditions. I wanted to get back to this condition of drought is insufficient water to meet demands or needs. So what we define it's shortages, which are expected demands minus expected supply. So how much water we are expecting minus how much water we actually have. We are defining droughts or shortages following this for users with complex portfolios. And what we're going to do, excuse me, it's to use the indicators that we just developed or we just explained to obtain deliveries from different supplies. So in the San Joaquin River, for example, we have different supply sources. We have local sources, we have imports from the Delta, and we have also groundwater. So what we're obtaining here, it's based on DWR's water balance deliveries that we have annual data from 2003 to 2019. Actually, now we are adding a few years here. We wanted to calibrate our model to obtain, if we could obtain the deliveries, or we could kind of match what DWR says. Excuse me. So what we're obtaining here is how users are actually managing their water supplies. And we have, what we see is that in 2013, 14, 15, users have much less surface water, so they are pumping much more. One important thing here that I wanted to highlight, if you only look at the deliveries, which is the total amount here, it's really difficult to see droughts in California. For example, I can tell you that 2012-16 was a really important drought, but you can see that 15, 14, and 13 was not really bad years in terms of deliveries. And if you compare to 2011 or 19, that were wet years. Actually, in 2011 and 19, we had so much rain that they had to, apply less water. And then what happens is also this management situation where farmers or cities pump much more water. So how we characterize droughts is by understanding these management effects. It's not only a lack of surface water, it's also that they are pumping much more water. So how we did this, it's by accounting for what we called unsustainable groundwater pumping, and also we are accounting for demand anomalies. We want to account for increasing evaporative demands over time. So while total deliveries are this amount, like the total bar that we have here, we kind of call effective deliveries to these three bars, like the green, and blue, lighter green and blue. And then this red, actually, it's telling us how much unsustainable pumping are farmers and cities making these years. So even that this is not, users actually had these supplies. They had these supplies because they were pumping too much. So they were doing unsustainable pumping. So this is kind of a drought situation. And this is going to affect groundwater levels. It's going to cause dry wells. So that has other situations. So we are able, with using our drought indicators, as I was mentioning here, to obtain deliveries from different water supply sources, but also obtain different effects like changes in groundwater levels, potentially using how much unsustainable groundwater pumping they are using. And this, even that this is not a shortage because they use the water, we are calling this an effective shortage because they are kind of borrowing the water from the future. Also for demand anomalies, we are also accounting this because for the same amount of water with more, with warmer temperatures, you have, you are irrigating less acres. So actually the increase in demand because of evapotranspiration, it's reducing water availability. So we are accounting for that too. And this gives us these water shortages. We can expand this to the full period of record that we have, 1991 to 2022. Actually, we have not now updated the data till 2025. And we can we can estimate shortages in every region following this methodology. As you can see now, in comparison to this thing that we had earlier, where you actually cannot see really clearly droughts, with this methodology, we can see the 2014-16 drought, 21-22, and then the 87-92 drought is here to 2007-9. We have a drought too. So we can obtain drought conditions for users that have different supply portfolios. And with that, we can obtain what we call the water system drought indicator, that gives us the effective shortages. Of course, this would be estimated shortages and not real shortages, but it gives us an information about how the situation could become. And what's interesting is that we can create this because we linked this with our drought indicators, with our water reservoir data, snowpack, groundwater levels, and all this information. We can obtain that kind of in real time, and we can know every time how we can update this every month to know how much expected shortages we are going to have at this month. This is an interesting graph too, where we actually, this is the system drought hazard indicator, and given the shortages that we have here in the bottom, we can obtain how many millions of acre feet less would farmers or cities would have in this hydrologic region. That could give us an information of the potential impacts. This is like, for example, the 10%, 20%, 30%, 40% reduction. And we have done this I just showed you for the San Joaquin River, but we have this data also for the Sacramento, the Tulare Lake, and also for the South Coast hydrologic region. Although I can tell you that the South Coast is quite complex, and we are still trying to improve the results with more data. Just to finalize, I wanted to show you what are the expected impacts of droughts. And this is a qualitative analysis that we have been doing. And as I was mentioning in the beginning, droughts are not only a function of the natural event, but also a function of how humans manage and adapt to these events. So we use a qualitative approach, and we focus on some examples in California to obtain exposure and vulnerability. Again, this follows this methodology on hazard, vulnerability, and exposure. Here, we are mostly focusing on how the different the three legs interact between them. Just an example here, because drought management, it's a comprehensive thing, or drought planning. It's important to look at these three effects because they are three different issues that can help us managing actions. For example, on hazard, we can manage infrastructure, we can manage water rights or regulations. On exposure, we can talk about land planning or crop planning. On vulnerability, water prioritization, water trading, conservation campaigns, emergency policies, safety nets, and others. So it's interesting to think about what are the management actions, given which is the three parts of the risk that you are exposed to. Let me just give you a few hints on, for example, on hazard. This is water supplies, the supply portfolio for different, the water supplies in Southern California. It's important, for example, this in the left, you see the purchase or import-dependent water suppliers. And I don't know if you follow the recent drought in 2020-22, some of these red circles here are local suppliers that rely, especially here in Ventura County or East LA. This is Southern California. They rely on state water project imports. So these users were really vulnerable during this past drought. While in the right, we have suppliers that are mostly groundwater dependent. So the drought vulnerability is going to be really different depending on the drought conditions. Another thing that is really interesting, or at least it was to me, is to see that the water rights, for example, has a big impact on your drought hazard. I'm showing here two different CBP water right holders, and this is Central California ID, and this is Westland Water District. And what we can see is that these two irrigation districts are actually getting the water from the same supplier, from the same reservoirs. So this is the the surface water drought indicator that we developed for the CBP, for the Delta exporting basins. And then we can see that the reduction in deliveries is much different. And you can see that here in the right. And this is because Westlands is a junior water right holder. So it's just to make the point that depending on your water rights, your drought hazard is going to be different, even if the reservoir has the same amount of water. So this is interesting to account for um, water drought hazard and final impacts for different uh, districts. Then we have the exposure for cities, how many cities, how many population lives in a city, it's how much people are exposed. For small communities, for example, I wanted to highlight this. This is this is domestic well counts for different basins in the Central Valley. And you can see that, there's places where if we have a drought, there's not many people that are going to be exposed, or we have important groundwater declines. But here in the Kings Basin, close to Fresno, or in the East San Joaquin basin, we have a lot of wells. So any variation in groundwater levels is going to mean a lot more. It's going to impact many more wells. So we have a much higher drought exposure, so much higher drought risk. For vulnerability, we have to think about how different users are able to adapt. We have for different metrics for vulnerability for cities, for small communities, for agriculture, and for the environment. Here, for example, I'm showing that we are characterizing high vulnerability depending on your initial per capita water use. Because usually, if you have more water use, you are more able to actually reduce water use without causing a lot of economic impacts. While if most of your water use, for example, these right dots, which are users with really low water per capita use, any reduction in water availability for these users is going to mean an impact potentially in indoor water users, or maybe in industrial or other important water uses. So vulnerability is also an important metric to consider. And we have been also trying to look at an analysis of drought impacts, looking at the taxonomy, because what we talk, we want to link drought conditions with drought impacts, but we kind of realized that we first need to define what's a drought impact. So that's why we started to think about how we can better define drought impacts. Okay, with that, I'm going to just give you a little bit, of the results of this ongoing project. I'm almost finalizing this presentation. We did a lot of outreach, convening sectoral advisory workshops, public events, blog posts, professional conferences. In terms of research outcomes, I wanted to bring this up. All the code and data, it's available at this GitHub account. All this is an ongoing development. But I would just suggest that if you are going to use this, just reach out to me to just be sure that you're using the right data. But all the information on these projects are here. We have also policy brief on scientific articles. We have one published, one under review, one two in preparation, and there's other related publications that we have been working in different projects that have been using data from this analysis. Finally, I wanted also to give a shout out to DWR's DRIP, collaborative DRIP. It's the Drought Resilience Interagency Partnership that has been convened by SB 552. I've been a member of this collaborative for 3 years, I think now. And this task force is formed by different agency members plus 18 non-state agency members too. So we are really happy also to know that one of the recommendations that we did last year, there was 6 overall recommendations. One of the recommendations was to develop this drought early warning systems, kind of supporting this idea, but also potentially supporting other efforts in the state. And the idea is to implement this over the next years. And just what's next, I'm gonna give you a hint of what's going on. So far, we have completed two projects. The first one, the 2020-23, where all the data is already available. The last one that we just finished in 20, the second one that we just finished in 25, sorry, in April, and that is kind of refining the indicators and looking at information on impacts. And then what we want to do is to develop what we call the California Drought Early Warning Dashboard, which would be a web-based application. We are right now working with NIDIS on finalizing the contract. We would like to start in October 25, and it is a 2-year project to develop this dashboard. And you already saw this, but the idea would be to finalize and compile all the information that we have created in a format that can be useful for stakeholders. One thing that I'm really interested on, I've talked that we have been working at a hydrologic regional level, but we are really interested in going at a finer scales. So for example, this is some experiments that we have already done with different things. For example, this is drought hazard at the irrigation district level in the Central Valley. This is using data from calcium models, and then we have also potentially developed drought hazard at the city level in California. We can do the same for different rivers, different counties for small communities and wells. So the idea here is potentially to experiment with some case studies at the final level. The problem here is that we have much less data in deliveries, and I can talk that about challenges. One other thing that I'm really interested is that we could develop what I call quasi-real-time estimations of drought impacts. And this is if we follow all the process that we've done or that I've kind of described today, we have the drought hazard that can be obtained with what the drought system hazard indicator. With that, we can define drought vulnerability as how much economic costs would be linked to, each reduction in water availability. And then if we have the exposure of the asset that it's exposed, we can obtain the final impact. And we can do this kind of in real time. I mean, it would be estimations, approximations, but I think it will be a really interesting tool, and I'm really interested in working on this. Yeah, then we'll go on the web application. And then finally, I wanted to mention that we want to use a collaborative process. We have been using a collaborative process in this project. So yeah, this is some of you we would like to have you on this project. And also to escalate this not only for California, but to the rest of the Western US. And with that, thanks so much for information. I'm really happy to respond questions and to follow up if you have any other following up questions. I can follow up with email. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you so much, Alvar. And those last few slides that you presented with some vision for where this could go, it's almost as though you were responding directly to the chat, even though I don't think you could see the chat as you were speaking. You were getting some great questions from folks in the audience on that. As Elisa alluded to, we get to start. We're in the lucky role of getting asked the first couple of questions. So I have a few for Alvar, but then we'll definitely make sure we turn to the great questions that many of you have posted in the chat. And if there's others that have questions still and you want to keep typing those in the chat, please do as I ask Alvar my first questions. And then Elisa, just let us know when we need to move into the audience questions section. So without further ado then, Alvar, I really love that this work recognizes the complexities of drought resilience and how the occurrence and felt impacts of dry periods really can vary spatially by group and by region. And I imagine that there are a multitude of dimensions and data sets that might be relevant beyond even those that you've utilized and explored within the work that's been done thus far. And so I'm just wondering, with regards to kind of other information and other indicators, have you already had some conversations outside the scope of this work about potential metrics and indicators worth further exploration that weren't covered today?
Yeah. Thanks. That's a really good question. Yeah, I mean, today this is data for lunch, right? I mean, data is the main thing for this project. Is kind of the basic thing that we need to develop. And for example, I'll tell you the first about a challenge that we have. Most of the things that we have developed have been at the hydrologic region level because we have excellent data from the WR at this scale. But we don't have really detailed scale for deliveries, for example, at the irrigation district level, at the city level, from different sources. So that actually challenges a lot our application at lower scale. So we would be super happy to collaborate with more people on that. I would tell you also, there's many things that we could, environmental data. There's some data on environmental water issues. You know that we have some, in some places in California, we don't have enough string gauges, for example, or also on ecosystems. So it's not only about the data, how much water is there, but also how ecosystems feel at drought, right? So we would like to have more on that. And then I would like to also give a shout out. There's many people working on this. It's not like, there's a lot of people working in data in California doing similar stuff in different things. I would like, for example, the Community Water Center has been working on the drinking water tool. I know that TNC and many others have been working on the California Environmental Framework. So there's many other similar tools or things that we could actually collaborate with other people. So yeah, we'll be super happy to work with more people on this.
Okay, great. Maybe some folks in the chat will have some suggestions. I think another layer, you spoke to sort of the complexity in terms of scale and complexities in terms of the different, groups that feel the impacts of drought. You just spoke to environmental impacts. I feel like another complexity that you also alluded to is the varying timeframes and needs of different decision processes and decision makers, right? Where some metrics and indicators really might be targeted towards planners who are looking to understand long-term resilience and risk, whereas others are really intended for real-time decision-making by agencies and emergency responders as an actual drought emergency is unfolding. And then there's kind of this third dimension of just Californians, the general public, trying to better understand their own exposure and drought risk, in those different timeframes. And so I wonder if you see a role for this work in all of those contexts, if there's kind of a need for different dashboards for those different purposes in your view. How do you tend to think about that, and where would you place the work that's been done versus where you're headed with this work into the future?
Thanks, Robin. It's really great. Actually, this reminds me, I've been so embedded in this work for many years that sometimes I kind of forget one of the main things here, and this is what we have been developing, or at least the idea behind this is kind of a real-time indication of drought conditions, right? It's okay. How are we today? It's the same kind of concept of the U.S. drought monitor, but related to California more complex water system. But what's interesting that I've been thinking a lot in potential expansions or collaborations with other people is that with the data that we are using, there's at least two things that many people have asked me, and it relates to the time frame. The first one is kind of short, medium-term forecast. Okay, given what we are today, what do we need to do in the next 6 months, 1 year, 2 years? I mean, it's a really complicated question. It's not an easy question, but we have the data to at least approach it in a better way that just we don't know what we're going to do, right? So we could at least get an informed decision. So that short-term forecast would be a really interesting potential extension. And the second one, as you were mentioning, it's planning. It's long-term. One thing I was actually showing to you, one of the graphs I showed about vulnerability or drought risk in irrigation districts. What I did there, it's great. For the past, actually, I got data from Calcim. It's like, for the past 100 years, how likely are you going to get, how likely are you able to get your water, right, to your full deliveries or not? So that gives us information about, vulnerability for planning. And again, the data we have compiled since 1990, where we have good enough information about reservoir data, stream flow data, groundwater, and all that, gives us already 45 years of data on issues that we could assess, like future looking for planning. So yeah, so there's these three different things, like real time, what's the situation right now, short-term forecasting or mid-term forecasting, and long-term planning. And I think that for now we are still in the first, real time, but all these issues could be addressed.
Okay, that's great. Elisa, how are we looking on time? Should I do one more of mine, or should we turn it over to the?
Yeah, you can do one more.
Okay. Yeah, so the last question that I have for you, Alvar, then just as a follow-on to that, I think I embedded it in my last question, but I'll bring it back up, is the idea of sort of user-serving interfaces for these indicators. And you mentioned the intent to develop a dashboard. And we've now talked about sort of different sectors that have an interest in this type of information, different timeframes, different types of decision makers. Do you have sort of a process? You mentioned wanting to have an advisory group. I'm just curious how you think about the design of the interface piece and how people access the data and interpret what they're looking at in a way that really is intuitive for those different types of folks. Hopefully that question made sense.
No, totally. It makes total sense. I have to say, so as I was mentioning, we had two projects, a 3-year project and then 1-year project, an extension. Especially the 3-year project that we did at the beginning, we had a really intense and intensive kind of collaborative approach. We put together 5 advisory groups for the 4 sectors plus 1 scientific advisory group. And then in the second project, we wanted more like to do kind of more geeky stuff, or like we have to finalize these kind of indicators. But the idea now for this third phase of the project is totally get back to the more collaborative approach. I also mentioned the DRIP initiative that, we have a lot of connections there with state agencies and with different stakeholders. But yes, I mean, if you are developing kind of a dashboard, I mean, we don't want to do this for like only academic purposes. We want to do this for the users to use it. So I think that the first thing to have to ask is, okay, how cities are going to, I mean, our first goal is for state decision makers and for people to understand drought conditions. But then also if locals want to use it, how this could be useful for them, how this could be useful for farmers, for counties or small communities, or for environmental groups. So the idea is to work with these groups to develop this tool better.
That's great. Very exciting. I have not been tracking as closely, Lisa. I see that you have some conversation going to encourage folks to come off mute and ask their questions. So I'll turn it over to you to facilitate that.
Yeah. I'm going to ask Emmanuel, hopefully I'm saying your name right, if they'd like to come off mute and ask your question.
Do you guys hear me now?
Yes.
All right. Hey, Alvar, great presentation. I really enjoy your presentation, and it's very insightful and informative. I actually have one question. Given that California's water supply strategy anticipates a 10% loss in water supply by 2040, I estimate like equivalent to 6 to 9 million acre-feet annually due to a hotter, dry climate. How can drought early warning systems evolve from being purely reactive tools into a proactive planning instruments that help mitigate or address this long-term supply deficit?
Hi, Manuel. Thanks so much for the question. This is great. So let me give you two. So I see this question at least in 2 different realms. The first realm is about one more academic thing that we have been thinking a lot, and it's that there's a lot of trends and climate change and many things. So our indicators are based on the 1990-2020. We can update this whenever we want, but we have to set up some kind of basic framework. And if climate change, if groundwater levels, if many other things are changing, what we're going to see is that the deliveries that we have are with respect to the 1990-2020. I think it's still useful in the sense that, okay, if I'm an irrigation district, I had in 1990-2020 1 million acre feet per year. or like 100,000 acre feet per year. I want to know how much with respect to that I can likely have this year. And this would, the complication here is when we update the time frames for people to, to the mental frames, what's normal and what's climate change new normal, right? But this is a thing, this is a big academic question right now. And I think it's really useful for still to think about, what people understand in the past 30 years, 35 years that had normal. The second answer that I would give you, it relates a little bit with the time framing that I was talking to Robin. The idea we have here is mostly about a real-time indication of drought. Okay, what's the situation right now, given what we have in the and how this could, how much deliveries, how much groundwater pumping, these kind of things we're going to have, given the situation today. For planning, it would be a different tool. And for planning, what we will have to think it's, okay, given what we had in the past 30, 40 years, and given the conditions that we're likely to have in the future, as you were mentioning about the reduction in water availability, how is the vulnerability for each city? I think that the data that we're using is super useful for this other tool, but this is not the tool that we are trying to develop right now. But I hope that responds to your question.
Awesome. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you.
We had another question from Tony. Tony, feel free to unmute if you're still here. I think I was just chatting with you.
I'm here.
Oh, great.
Thanks for the presentation. I really enjoyed it. One of the questions, and maybe it's kind of a concern as well, is when you go in front of stakeholders and you show a graph, and the graph says, oh, we're expecting a shortfall of X amount of thousands of acre feet of water, they believe you. And where I'm going with this is that each one of the indices has a certain error bar associated with it. The correlations are great statistically, but there is a certain amount of error bar associated with that. So how do we incorporate that error bar in our conversations with the public to say, yes, the value is 250 plus or minus 20%? How do we communicate that to them? Because if you just give them a number, it suddenly becomes in concrete. And that's what they expect to have happen. So is there a way to present your information that says, here are the uncertainties with this number that we're calculating? Okay, I'll be quiet and let you lead.
That's a really great comment and question. Yes, totally. I totally agree with you. This gives me, or brings me to this idea of like, one of the big positive things of the US Drought Monitor is the simplicity. And I think as a communication tool, simplicity is great. But yes, we need more nuances, and we need to be more, kind of truthful on how we communicate data. And I agree. I have to tell you that our regressions are great, but we have so few points of data that I'm really concerned about this regression sometimes, like talking academically about that. I think it's much better than what we have right now, but it's kind of really almost nothing. But yes, we should communicate that. We should communicate uncertainty bars. For now, my goal with this right now, in the situation that we are right now in the development, I am not aiming to do this for an irrigation district to use it as their own decision-making tool, because I don't think that this is the goal. It's more to see a view of overall California and like different hydrologic regions or regional disparities on drought conditions. But yes, if this could move forward to be more, for example, I was mentioned here, we could estimate SWP deliveries or CBP deliveries. I mean, in that case, where people actually are relying on that, we should give them a lot of, uncertainty bars on, this is what we estimate, but this could be as high as this and as low as this. And this gives us, also gets to the point of short, midterm forecasting. In California, when you go, we all know that when we go 6 months, like especially between October and April, we have a lot of uncertainty. So depending on when are you doing the kind of the estimation and forecasting and this kind of thing, uncertainty is going to change a lot. But yeah, I really appreciate this point. I know we should be careful, or like, especially if, as I mentioned, I am not aiming this tool right now to be a tool for local decision making. But if we get into this, we should be more truthful about uncertainties and potential errors. Thanks for the question.
Thank you.
We have another question from Jesse. Jesse, you want to unmute and ask your question and discuss with Alvar?
Sure. Thank you, Elisa. Hey, Alvar. Great work. Thank you very much. So, as a state employee, my work is often kind of constrained by, and responses to drought are kind of constrained by these emergency declarations and, official actions that declare this a drought. And so I'm kind of interested, and I think you touched on this a bit, in how policies can be more responsive to these quantitative indicators. Maybe it's more about what you said of getting these in front of the decision makers and the people that advise them and showing them, what these qualitative indicators suggest. But I'd be interested to explore how we can try to be at least a little bit more quickly reactive in these situations.
Thanks, Jesse. Nice to hear from you. Yes. I was thinking I agree with you. So it's like that one of the main goals of this, actually, the kind of originating question was, could we do better at least what's a drought declaration, how we declare droughts, even when I think about emergency funding. So we should be more, use more informed decision making in, like, when you are spending millions of dollars during a drought, right? So that was the idea behind this. For example, we could signal hotspots for dry wells. We could signal potential problems for environmental species, right? And one other thing, so I think that's what the tool is for. At least is what we started thinking about, or the question that we had in mind. I wanted also to add, there's other states that have, for example, I think Washington has an official tool to declare emergency drought declarations. So I'm not trying to say to this, but I think it could be, it would add transparency to state agencies messaging, saying, okay, this is what, drought situation right now, and this is why we are declaring the drought. And for example, just as an example, in 2014, like the drought declaration in 2014, April 1st, or I think it was January 17th, 2014, was for the whole state at the same time. I think that many counties actually were not in drought in that moment, or at least were not really feeling the drought. In 2020-22, the drought declarations were county level, and it moved from, Marin County south, which made more sense from the hydrological or meteorological standpoint. So I think that, these kind of tools could be helpful on having a clear trigger on when we are declaring droughts. Why are we declaring droughts? And even in which sectors? Maybe there's different sectors, or maybe different even utilities that are feeling the drought more because they are fully reliant on a state water project. So yeah, again, I'm not saying that this is, but I think that advancing in this type of research, being more tailored to drought conditions could be helpful. And thanks for the question.
Great ideas. Thank you, Alvar.
Awesome. We have a couple more questions in the chat. Gino, you wanted to stay on mute. So I'll read this out loud to you, Alvar. It appears the dashboard will primarily serve city planners in managing water delivery systems. Will it also provide management plans, including response and mitigation actions tailored to varying drought conditions? I think you kind of answered a little bit of that.
I can go like, so the idea here for now is to be more a kind of real-time indication of the situation. It's not still for planning purposes, or at least it's not our main goal. As I mentioned, I think it could be using the same data we could do. I mean, we would need better models maybe, but it's I think that we could do it in an expansion or a different work.
Awesome. And then relatedly, Britta had a question. Britta, if you wanted to come off mute.
Sure thing. Hi, Alvar. Nice to see you again, and thank you for this presentation. I was curious to ask if you have any plans to scale this to other states in the arid West, and what challenges you might encounter in trying to do so. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Brita. Thanks so much for the question. Okay, the current, and this is internal conversation, but the idea of 90s is to use this as a case study for potentially scaling this up to other places. So yes, I could tell you, I mean, 90s is interested in, it's interested in scaling this up for places. We are, about the challenges that you mentioned, I could say a couple of things. We are trying to be comprehensive here, for example, doing cities, small communities, environment, and agriculture. I've been thinking about expanding my research, like potentially ask for grants, like national grants for other things. I think it would be. I think that at the city level could be simpler to start with, because there's a lot of data on cities, and cities are, have more money first, and then have the ability to have this data available. And I could tell you also, like the drought impact on cities is huge. So we don't want to have drought impacts in cities. So I think that it could be potentially relatively, not straightforward, but using the same methodology, we could do that. Not even to the west, to the whole United States, I think. Irrigation water is more complicated given data limitations, but I think we could do that for the West totally. I mean, the idea is if we have the data, we have the framework. I have to say also, and this is a shout out to California agencies. California has a lot of data. So we are super lucky for all the data. Of course, we need more, but we are really lucky to have all the data that the public agencies, the state agencies are publishing, and even local agencies. So when you look at other states, it's not as as available. So we need data to develop that, but I think that we could do it. Yeah.
Awesome.
And I would say that I'm really interested actually in extending this to other parts of the US.
Thanks, Britta. Thanks, Alvar. We have another question. Gayatri, if you want to come off mute.
Sure. Thanks, Alyssa. Lovely presentation, Alvar. I'm curious about whether you're already incorporating, or you're planning to incorporate any of the climate change modeling. So using data, using the downscale models.
This is a really good question. We are not using climate change data here. We're using historical data for everything. But when I was mentioning earlier, for if potentially expanding it for kind of more planning, developing a tool that is more for planning purposes, right? What's the vulnerability of different California cities to water shortages in the future? We should definitely be using models and climate change conditions. I'm working in different projects on climate change analysis. So there's the potential combination between these frameworks to actually develop this. And I think, to be honest, I'm even surprised that sometimes I think I never seen a map of California city vulnerability to climate change. So if anyone wants kind of research ideas, like what's the vulnerability of different cities in California against climate change, or irrigation districts, or others. So I think that's a really interesting potential approach.
Yeah, I think
Thanks for.
some of the cities actually have those maps, but they probably don't share it widely, because I've seen some of that in the Bay Area, at least where I am.
They do, yes, sorry, they do develop their own urban water management plans. But what I mean is like for the state in comparing vulnerability across different suppliers would be interesting to see, okay, where are we vulnerable? And I think that that's a thing that it's maybe combining this, what we have also with the urban water management plans is that everyone uses different approaches or different, so it's not exactly consistent. But yes, I'm especially larger utilities, they do a great job. I think it would be even interesting as a developing a public benefit for everyone, especially for small utilities, to develop this kind of overall vulnerability of urban utilities. Thanks for that.
Thank you.
So thank you so much, Alvar, for all of your amazing research and giving us your time. And thank you to everyone who joined the Data for Lunch. Again, please look at the links in the chat. We'll follow up with a recording afterwards in the next week or two. But again, thank you all so much, especially you, Alvar and Robin, for joining us for Data for Lunch today.